Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome.
Mm.
Today, we're going to tackle a topic that's been incredibly influential in American politics, but maybe not in the way you'd immediately think.
Oh, interesting. Lay it on me.
We're diving into the world of the Christian right,
Ah,
and we'll be using this awesome book, God's Own Party, The Making of the Christian Right by Daniel K. Williams, to guide us.
sounds fascinating. I'm ready to learn.
Me too, because there are so many twists and turns in their story. It's way more complex than I initially thought.
I bet.
Our mission today is to really get how this movement went from like the fringes of American society to becoming this major force, especially in politics, and how they used their faith to really shape social issues and elections.
I mean, you hear about the Christian right all the time, especially in recent decades, but I honestly don't know much about their history.
Right, you kind of think it's a recent thing, but that's what's so wild.
Oh.
Their story actually goes back almost a century.
Wow, seriously.
Yeah, think back to the Roaring Twenties flappers, jazz.
A time of major cultural shift.
Exactly. And right in the thick of it, you had fundamentalists battling all that cultural liberalism, but get this, through politics.
So they weren't just reacting to the changes, they were actively trying to shape the country through political means.
Totally. They were already fighting to protect what they saw as America's Christian identity. Like, think about the anti-evolution campaigns of that era.
Right, trying to prevent evolution from being taught in schools.
And prohibition, too.
Yeah, banning alcohol, very much driven by moral and religious convictions.
Exactly. So you see this theme of reclaiming America for their vision popping up even way back then.
Makes you realize it's a much longer and deeper story than many realize.
Absolutely. And it's not always predictable either.
How so?
Well, take World War II, for instance. Suddenly you see fundamentalists who had been pretty wary of getting involved in politics before, finding common ground with the government.
Interesting. Why the change?
Well, it all boils down to one word: communism.
The Cold War.
Exactly. The threat of godless communism became this really powerful unifying force, bringing together all these different Protestant groups that didn't always see eye to eye. And during this time, the National Association of Evangelicals, or the NAE, starts advocating for evangelicals to have a more active role in public life.
Makes sense. They saw fighting communism as a moral imperative, a way to protect their faith and their country.
And no one embodies this merging of evangelical Christianity and, like, fervent patriotism more than Billy Graham.
Oh, absolutely. Billy Graham's crusades were huge. He became this national icon, influencing presidents and drawing massive crowds.
It's wild to think about the influence he had. Like, imagine being able to advise President Nixon on which Southern Baptist pastors to invite to the White House.
Whoa, really? He had that kind of pull.
Yeah, and not just any pastors, he'd tell Nixon who to invite based on their political leanings.
Wow, that's wielding power beyond the pulpit for sure. Talk about political savvy.
Right. I mean, who knew? But then things get even more interesting when we get to the 1960s, this decade of massive social upheaval. You'd think evangelicals would be up in arms about those Supreme Court rulings against school prayer and Bible reading.
Yeah, that seems like it would be right up their alley.
Well, here's the surprise: they weren't all that upset at first.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. Turns out, a lot of them actually agreed with those early decisions.
Now, that is unexpected. So what was their reasoning?
Well, for them, the issue wasn't about prayer being removed from schools. It was more about who was composing those prayers.
Ah, so it was a matter of control.
Exactly. They didn't believe in state-composed prayers. They were all about spontaneous personal prayer, not government-mandated rituals.
So it wasn't the simple against school prayer narrative we often hear. It's much more nuanced than that.
It's about who gets to define religious practice, which is something that comes up again and again in their story.
I'm starting to see the pattern here.
Right. It was only when later rulings targeted devotional Bible reading, something they saw as core to their faith and America's Protestant heritage, that they really felt attacked.
That feeling of being under siege, their values being eroded, I think that's really what fuels their political engagement from this point on.
It's like one specific detail can totally change your understanding of a whole event.
Yeah.
But this period also reveals some, well, darker aspects of the movement. You had figures like Billy James Hargis and Bob Jones Sr. who actually saw the civil rights movement as a communist plot.
Oh, wow. That's pretty extreme.
Yeah, and it shows how, for some, those lines between religious and political motivations got really blurry.
It's important to acknowledge these strands, even if they're uncomfortable, because it reminds us that the Christian right has never been one big unified bloc. It's a story of alliances, of fractures, of internal debates, just as much as it is about their impact on American politics.
Totally. And speaking of complex figures, let's talk about Jerry Falwell. The man went from denouncing political activism to leading the moral majority.
That's quite the transformation.
Falwell's journey really embodies this evolution of the Christian right. He starts local, tackling things like sex education, which tapped into all these anxieties people had about social change.
Right, those hot-button issues that really get people fired up.
And his success, combined with the work of some really savvy political strategists, people like Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie, catapulted him onto the national stage.
So he had the passion, and they knew how to translate that into political power, a potent combination.
And it all kind of explodes with Ronald Reagan. He's often credited with the Christian right's rise to power, but was it really that simple?
Well, while Reagan definitely benefited from their support, I think it's an oversimplification to say it was the sole reason for his victory.
Yeah, there were a lot of factors at play.
The political climate was ripe for a conservative shift, economic anxieties, the Cold War still looming.
Plus, Reagan himself was a charismatic figure who appealed to a broader audience than just the evangelical base.
Absolutely. He managed to unite a lot of different strands of conservatism under his banner.
So more like a perfect storm than a single cause.
Uh,
But even with Reagan in the White House, the moral majority still faced a lot of hurdles.
Definitely. For one, they struggled to turn their social agenda into actual laws.
So despite their influence, they couldn't always get what they wanted.
And they were also plagued by internal conflicts and scandals. That always hurts.
Yeah, it definitely damaged their image.
But most importantly, I think they faced a disconnect with public opinion. Most Americans, even those with conservative views, weren't fully on board with the moral majority's vision for America.
Like their stance on the Briggs Initiative.
Exactly. That attempt to ban gay rights in California probably alienated more people than it attracted.
It highlights this constant tension for the Christian right. How do you engage politically without compromising your beliefs and appeal to a broader audience without alienating your base?
It's a delicate balancing act, that's for sure, and it's something they're still grappling with today.
Yeah, it's a challenge they've been dealing with for decades now. But before we get too far ahead, let's go back to how they kept things moving after the moral majority kind of stumbled.
Right, because it wasn't over for them. Their story didn't just end with Reagan, did it?
Not at all, actually. The 1990s brought a whole new approach, a whole new way of doing things.
Oh, really?
Yeah, figures like Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed step onto the scene.
Okay, I remember those names.
They shifted to a much more strategic and grassroots focus and really concentrated their efforts within the Republican Party itself.
So it's less about making big pronouncements from the pulpit and more about actually winning elections.
Exactly. It's about working behind the scenes, influencing policy from the ground up.
And did that work? Did that quieter approach end up paying off?
Well, organizations like the Christian Coalition really started gaining serious power within the Republican Party, shaping their platform and mobilizing voters.
So they were really pulling the strings. In a way, yeah. But this also brought about a new set of challenges.
Oh.
There was a growing criticism that they were becoming too entangled with partisan politics.
I see. So they risked alienating those moderate evangelicals who maybe weren't as gung-ho about one specific party?
Exactly. It's that tightrope walk again. How do you engage in politics without compromising your beliefs or alienating potential supporters? And some figures tried to find a different path altogether.
Like who?
Well, you had James Dobson with his organization Focus on the Family.
Right, I've heard of that.
He wanted to be more independent, holding politicians accountable to his specific moral standards, no matter what party they belonged to.
So it's like he was saying, I'm not playing your partisan games. I'm going to hold you all to my own standards.
Exactly. He wasn't afraid to call out anyone who didn't measure up in his view.
Interesting. So even within this movement, there's all this diversity, different leaders, different strategies.
It's never as simple as it seems from the outside.
And then you've got George W. Bush,
Yeah.
a president who was very open about his evangelical faith.
It really felt like the Christian right had reached a pinnacle of influence at that point.
Yeah, with figures like John Ashcroft and key positions in his administration.
Exactly. They had a real seat at the table.
But even then, did they actually always get what they wanted?
Well, that's the thing. Even with a president who shared their beliefs, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Remember Bush's faith-based initiative?
Yeah, that's a big part of his platform.
He actually faced criticism from some within the Christian right.
No way. Seriously.
Yeah, figures like Pat Robertson weren't happy because it restricted funding for charities that also engaged in proselytizing.
Oh, wow. So even there, within a seemingly aligned administration, you've got friction and disagreement.
It just goes to show there are always different perspectives and interpretations, even within a movement that appears unified from the outside.
It's so much more complicated than I initially thought.
Yeah.
And this period also saw the Christian right really pushing for the federal marriage amendment.
Right, that attempt to ban same-sex marriage nationwide.
It seemed like such a huge focus for them. Do you think it backfired in the end?
It's a good question. By focusing so intently on one highly controversial issue, they might have alienated potential allies who might have been sympathetic to their broader message about traditional marriage.
It's like they drew such a hard line that it made it harder to build bridges with those who might have been on the fence.
Exactly. And it raises the question of strategy versus ideology. How do you achieve your goals without compromising your core beliefs? Something they've been wrestling with for a long time.
And it's not like their concerns just vanished after that. The Christian right has continued to be a major player in shaping the Republican Party's platform and getting conservative voters to the polls.
Absolutely. Their impact on American politics, from social issues to electoral outcomes, is undeniable. They've had their ups and downs, their victories and setbacks, but they've consistently found ways to adapt and remain relevant.
It's a fascinating story of a movement in constant evolution, responding to the changing cultural and political landscape around them.
And now we find ourselves in the 21st century, a time of rapid technological advancements, a more diverse and fragmented society. It makes you wonder how the digital age has influenced their strategies and impact.
Right, we can't ignore the elephant in the room. The internet has changed everything. How has it shaped the Christian right?
Well, I think it's been a game changer for them. Social media has given them a whole new set of tools to spread their message and connect with their supporters.
It's like they've been able to bypass those traditional media gatekeepers and build direct lines of communication with their base.
Exactly. It allows them to foster a sense of community and shared identity in a way that wasn't possible before.
But does that also raise concerns about creating echo chambers where their message resonates without much scrutiny or challenge?
Absolutely. It's a valid concern. When people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs, it becomes difficult to have productive dialogue and bridge divides.
And doesn't that just lead to further polarization in our already deeply divided society?
It's definitely a risk, and it highlights the need for media literacy, for people to be able to critically evaluate the information they're consuming and to be open to engaging with different perspectives.
We've talked a lot about the relationship with the Republican Party, but is there any common ground to be found with the Democrats?
Historically, there's been very little overlap, especially on issues like abortion and LGBTQ rights.
Right, those have been major points of contention.
There have been attempts at dialogue, particularly during the Obama years, on issues like poverty alleviation. But those deep divisions on social issues make it hard to find lasting common ground.
It's like there's this deep-seated distrust on both sides.
And the current political climate, with its partisan gridlock and win-at-all-costs mentality, doesn't help.
So where does this leave the Christian right in the 21st century? They've been so closely aligned with the Republican Party, but that party itself seems to be going through an identity crisis with the rise of Trumpism. Where do they fit in now?
It's a really interesting question. Their loyalty to the Republican Party is being tested, with some wholeheartedly embracing Trump, while others express reservations about his conduct and policies.
So it's causing some real internal divisions.
Definitely.
Yeah.
How they navigate this tension will be crucial for their future influence.
As we wrap up our deep dive into the history and evolution of the Christian right, one thing is crystal clear. This is a complex, multifaceted movement.
Absolutely. They've shown remarkable adaptability responding to shifting cultural and political tides, but their core values, a belief in traditional family structures, moral absolutes, and a distinctly Christian vision for America, seem to remain constant.
It's those core values that continue to motivate and mobilize their base. But the question is, can they make those values resonate with younger generations who are increasingly focused on things like climate change, economic inequality, and social justice?
Will they cling to the culture wars of the past, or will they embrace a more inclusive and expansive vision of faith, one that transcends those old battles and speaks to the challenges of the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question. Will they hold on to a shrinking base, or will they adapt and evolve to connect with a new generation?
It's a high-stakes gamble for sure.
And with that thought-provoking cliffhanger, we'll wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore those questions in more depth and trying to glimpse into the future of the Christian right. All right, so we've made it to the final part of our deep dive into the Christian right.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. From their early battles over evolution to their struggles to adapt to this digital world we live in.
Yeah.
But now, the big question, what's next for them? What does the future hold for this movement that's had such a huge impact on American politics?
Well, predicting the future is always a tricky business.
Definitely.
But I think it's safe to say the Christian right is at a crossroads.
Yeah, what they've traditionally focused on, abortion, same-sex marriage, the role of religion in public life, it's running up against a new generation with a whole different set of priorities.
It's a generation that's maybe not as concerned with those same culture war battles.
Right, exactly. And we've already seen hints of this shift, like with Rick Warren.
Oh, interesting example.
He's really pushing for a more, holistic approach to faith.
In what way?
Well, he's tackling things like poverty, social justice, alongside those traditional conservative concerns.
So he's not abandoning those core values, but he's adding to the agenda.
It's like he's trying to bridge that gap between the old guard and a more, progressive wing of evangelicalism.
And he's had some success with it, right? Speaking at events for both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush.
Yeah, he's advocated for HIV/AIDS awareness, poverty alleviation, but he still holds those traditional views on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage.
So it's a complex picture, not easily categorized.
But the question is, can this more inclusive approach really take hold within the broader movement?
Yeah, will the old guard see it as a compromise, a watering down of their core values?
There's definitely tension there. Some folks see any deviation from that traditional agenda as a slippery slope.
Right, like they could lose their identity, their purpose.
But others, they see this need to adapt, to speak to these younger evangelicals who are way more focused on things like climate change, economic inequality.
It's almost like they're facing a choice. Hold on tight to a shrinking base, or evolve to connect with the new generation.
And the outcome of that choice is going to have a huge impact on American politics.
No doubt. If the Christian right wants to stay relevant in the 21st century, they got to figure out how to bridge this generational divide.
Can they embrace a broader vision of faith, one that speaks to those who are worried about climate change, social justice, economic inequality?
Can they broaden their appeal without compromising their core values? It's a tough question.
It would require a serious re-examination of their beliefs and priorities.
A lot of soul searching for sure.
But if they pulled it off, they could become a major force for change in this country, shaping things in ways we can't even imagine yet.
The potential is there, but it's a big if.
On the flip side, if they just cling to those culture wars of the past,
They risk becoming more and more irrelevant, their voice fading away as a new generation takes over.
it's like a crossroads. So many possibilities, so much uncertainty.
And it's not up to us to decide which path they'll choose. It's ultimately a decision for the millions of people who make up this incredibly complex movement.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with a lot more questions than answers.
But that's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's not a neat little story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's messy, it's ongoing, full of twists and turns, moments of triumph, and moments of setback.
And the story of the Christian right is a perfect example of that. It's a story of faith and politics, of power and influence, of adaptation and evolution, and most importantly, it's a story that's still being written.
Absolutely. We're living through it right now.
Then who knows what the next chapter holds. But we hope you've enjoyed exploring this part of American history with us.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
We encourage you to keep digging deeper, to question the narratives you encounter, and to form your own conclusions about the forces shaping our world.
Because understanding the past is essential to navigating the present and shaping the future.
So well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious.